Hey there, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're all about the foundations of democracy, kind of a journey through the big ideas and messy realities of how it works, how it's supposed to work, all that good stuff.
And it's interesting, the listener sent in this collection of excerpts, a kind of I guess, a greatest hits of democratic thought from, well, a specific place, but the themes, they resonate way beyond that.
Absolutely. So we're talking ancient philosophers to, well, pretty recent thinkers, all wrestling with this idea of how do we make sure people have a say in their own governing? Buckle up.
And I think what'll be really fascinating for our listener is how this all connects to leadership. What makes someone a truly democratic leader, versus someone who, well, maybe has some dictatorial tendencies. We'll get into all that.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock way, way back.
Oh.
Ancient Athens, the whole shebang, direct democracy. They actually met up in person, citizens did, to hash things out, vote on laws, the whole 9 yards.
Can you imagine that today? I mean, chaos maybe, but also kind of inspiring, right? Of course, it wasn't perfect, only free men, all that. But still, the very idea that everyday people could directly shape their government, that was radical.
Which makes you think, how direct does democracy have to be these days? I mean, we have representatives, but is that enough? Big question.
Still debating that one. But let's jump over to ancient Rome for a second. Not a full-blown democracy, but they gave us this idea of veto power. Certain officials could actually block decisions made by the bigwigs, especially if they felt it was, harming the people.
Checks and balances.
Exactly. The seed of that idea is right there in ancient Rome, that no one person, no matter how powerful, gets to just call all the shots.
And that, I think, is where things get really interesting. We're going to fast forward a bit here, about 600 years or so, to when the Apostle Paul writes his letter to the Galatians. Now, bear with me here, because this gets to the heart of some core democratic values. He says, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, we're all equal in the eyes of God.
Powerful stuff, right? Now, we're not getting into a theology lesson here, but that idea, that inherent equality of all people, that's like a bomb going off in a world where hierarchy is everything. And you can draw a direct line from that idea to, well, pretty much every democratic revolution and social justice movement since.
It's like this underlying principle that says, hold on, if we're all equal on a fundamental level, then maybe our systems of government should reflect that too.
Exactly. And that's a thread we're going to keep pulling on as we move forward.
So let's do some more time traveling, shall we? This time, we're jumping ahead to 1241 AD, and we have this document, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but I'm going to try to Jais glove. Basically, it lays out this, well, for the time, radical idea. The law, which should serve the good of the people, not just the whims of whoever's in charge.
Huge. We take this for granted now, the rule of law, but back then, revolutionary. The idea that even the king, the ruler, is bound by the same laws as everyone else. That's a cornerstone of how we think about democracy today.
It's like, okay, we're starting to see the ingredients of democracy come together here, even if it takes a while for the whole recipe to, fully bake.
Exactly. And speaking of shaking things up, we can't forget Martin Luther and the Reformation. 1517, he nails his thesis to the church door, challenges the authority of the Catholic Church, and argues that everyone should be able to interpret the Bible for themselves. Now, you might be thinking, what's that got to do with democracy? But it's huge.
Okay, I'll bite. Explain the connection.
Think about it. If people can interpret the Bible for themselves, why not apply that same principle to other areas of life, including, you guessed it, government? This is the beginning of individual thought and conscience being seen as important and dangerous, at least to the powers that be.
So by questioning one powerful institution, he inadvertently opened the door for people to question authority in general. That makes sense.
And that takes us right to the Enlightenment in the 1700s. Big names here, John Locke, remember that name, and Montesquieu. They're all about natural rights, government by consent, the separation of powers.
These are the ideas that fuel revolutions.
Exactly.
These are the ideas that fuel revolutions.
Exactly. The American and French revolutions, they drew heavily from these Enlightenment thinkers. It shows how these ideas weren't just, stuck in some dusty old books, but actually pushed people to fight for a better world, a more democratic world.
Right. It reminds us that democracy isn't like this finished product, but something we're constantly working towards, debating, refining. Which actually, that makes me think of this thinker, N.F.S. Grundtvig, bit of a mouthful, I know. But he had this, kind of a counterintuitive take on individual freedom.
Yeah, Grundtvig, now there's a thinker who really grappled with the nuances of democracy. He was actually wary of too much individual freedom, thought it might erode the social fabric, like if everyone just out for themselves, what holds society together?
Which is a question we're still asking today, right?
Yeah.
The individual versus the collective. How do we balance those two impulses, those two needs?
It's the constant tension at the heart of democracy. Think about it. Debates around healthcare, taxes, the environment, it all boils down to how much individual freedom are we willing to give up for the good of the whole? No easy answers there.
For sure. It's all about, like you said, finding that balance, that sweet spot.
Yeah.
And speaking of different perspectives, we got to talk about these two 20th century thinkers, Hal Koch and Alf Ross. They had very different views on how democracy should actually function.
Oh, Koch and Ross, yeah. This is a good one. They really highlight the different ways of thinking about democracy. So Koch, and remember that name, Koch and Ross, he was all about the process, the messy back and forth, the dialogue, even the arguments. To him, that was democracy in action.
So it's not just about the what, like the policies or laws we end up with, but the how, the way we get there,
Yeah.
that constant conversation.
Exactly. Whereas Ross, he was much more focused on I guess you could say, the nuts and bolts of democracy voting, elections, constitutions, the rule of law, the whole kit and caboodle.
Two sides of the same coin then. Like, you need both the robust process and the solid structures for a healthy democracy.
I think that's a really important point for our listeners to grasp. It's not enough to just have the institutions in place. You need a culture of active citizenship, people who are engaged, informed, willing to have those tough conversations, even when they disagree.
So it's not passive. Democracy takes work, takes effort from all of us. So as we move into, the modern era with all its complexities, its global challenges, how do these historical insights help us navigate that? What can we learn from all this, especially when it comes to leadership? How do we know if someone's truly a democratic leader as opposed to, well, someone with maybe, shall we say, some dictatorial tendencies?
Now that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Especially these days. But I think if we look back at everything we've talked about, there are some pretty clear signs, some red flags, things our listeners can look out for.
Okay, hit us with it. What are some of those red flags? What should people be paying attention to, especially when it comes to those, those in power or those seeking power?
One of the biggest ones, and it's a biggie, is a disdain for dissent. A true democratic leader, they understand that disagreement is not only natural, it's essential in a free society. They don't shy away from it. They welcome different viewpoints, even if they challenge their own. A dictator, on the other hand, they see any kind of opposition as a threat, something to be, well, silenced.
So if a leader or a would-be leader, if they're constantly, shutting down debate, demonizing their opponents, labeling anyone who disagrees with them as the enemy, that's a bad sign.
Huge red flag. It shows a lack of respect for that fundamental democratic principle, that marketplace of ideas, that clash of perspectives that actually helps us move forward as a society.
So it's not just about what they say, but how they handle disagreement, how they react to those who see the world differently.
Absolutely. And another thing to watch out for is a disregard for the rule of law. Now, this can be subtle, but it's important. A democratic leader, they understand that they are not above the law. They are accountable to it, just like everyone else. A dictator, though, they see the law as something to be manipulated or ignored to get what they want.
So it's about transparency too, right?
Yeah.
Are they operating in the open? Are they being honest about their dealings, their finances, all of it? Or are they trying to hide things, operate in the shadows?
Exactly. Transparency and accountability, those are hallmarks of a democratic leader. They're not afraid of scrutiny from the press, from the public, from their opponents even. They welcome it. It's how they build trust.
So to be a truly democratic leader, it's not enough to just talk the talk. You have to walk the walk.
100%. And on that note, I think we should spend some time talking about what we as citizens, as individuals, can do to be more engaged, more informed, more democratic in our own lives.
Because it's not all on the leaders, right? We have
Right.
a role to play too.
Absolutely. We all have a part to play in this grand experiment we call democracy.
So we talked about, the what of democracy, the where it came from, the what to look for in a leader, all that. But what's the takeaway for the everyday person listening to this? How do we actually do democracy better?
That's the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
right? And it's easy to feel like, well, what can I do? It's all, big systems, powerful people. But there's actually a lot you can do, even small things that make a difference.
Okay, so break it down for us. What's one concrete thing people can start doing, like today, to be more engaged citizens?
Be informed. Sounds simple, right? But seriously, with all the noise out there these days, The misinformation, the spin, being a critical consumer of news, of information, that's more vital than ever.
Don't just believe everything you read on the internet. Shocking, I know.
Sadly, it needs to be said. Question everything. Who's telling you this? Why? Are they trying to persuade you of something? Or are they giving you the full picture? Look for evidence, not just opinions dressed up as facts.
And that thing about, if it sounds too good to be true, or maybe it confirms your biases a little too perfectly, probably worth double checking.
100%. We all have our biases, me included. So get your news from a variety of sources, not just the ones you agree with. Talk to people who see the world differently than you do. It's uncomfortable sometimes, but that's how we grow.
Disagreement, as long as it's respectful, that's actually a sign of a healthy democracy, right?
Yeah.
Not something to be afraid of.
Exactly. Okay, so be informed, be critical. But then what? What else can people do? Well, voting. Obviously, that's huge. But it's not the only answer.
Right, it can't be like vote and then forget about it for 4 years kind of thing.
Nope, gotta stay engaged. Contact your representatives, local, national, whoever. Write to them, call their offices, let them know what you care about.
I feel like people get intimidated by that, like, oh, they're too busy for my little email.
But that's what they're there for. Seriously, never underestimate the power of making your voice heard. Even if it's just you, one person, speaking up.
And these days, there are so many ways to get involved beyond just like the traditional stuff.
Totally. Find a local group, a cause that resonates with you, and put in some time, some energy. Volunteer, donate, whatever you can do. Even just spreading the word, raising awareness, it all makes a difference.
Social media too, right? For all its flaws, it can be a powerful tool for connecting with people, mobilizing around issues you care about.
Use it wisely, though. It's easy to get sucked into those echo chambers, just talking to people who already agree with you. Make an effort to step outside of that, engage with different perspectives, even if it gets a little heated sometimes.
As long as it's respectful, as long as the goal is to understand, not just, score points.
Exactly. It all goes back to that idea of democracy as an ongoing process, a conversation. It's not a spectator sport.
Right, it's on all of us to, to keep the lights on, so to speak, to keep that conversation going, to keep asking questions, keep pushing for a better world.
Well said. And I think that's a good note to end on, actually. Yeah. It's been a fascinating deep dive, this whole conversation. We've covered so much ground, from ancient Greece to, well, today's headlines. But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's that democracy is not a given. It's not something we inherit and then just, sit back and enjoy. It takes work, it takes effort, it takes all of us.
It's a journey, not a destination, right?
Exactly. And it's a journey we take together.
Well, on that note, listener, we hope this has given you some food for thought, maybe even inspired you to get a little more involved in shaping the world you want to live in. We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.